Hi everybody, this is Karak with ACG and welcome to another Walking the Walk. This episode is going to be Mass Effect. Now, there's 3 games, so I will be doing 3 videos, but this will be the first video and I will try to contain information about each game within its specific video. So if you notice that maybe something's missing about a story aspect or so forth, expect to see it in Mass Effect 2's video or Mass Effect 3's video. As always, these are not purely technical demonstrations or discussions. It's not console war bullshit either, where we're not going to be talking about the difference between the Xbox 360 version and the PS3 version versus the PC version. That's for kiddie school. This is more about the look and feel of the game and if the technical and artistic elements and gameplay elements of the game to see if it equaled the PR that we saw. Now, sure, if technical stuff comes up, I will end up talking about it, but for the most part, that's not exactly what this is about. So as always, I hope you guys like the video. If you do, maybe subscribe. Here we go. Walking the Walk, Mass Effect. I suppose it's fitting that we start talking about the title because we're on that screen right now, but the fact that this was at one time originally called Science Fiction X, and so much so that journalists, developers, everybody started talking about this new game from BioWare that was called Science Fiction X. Honestly thought that's what it was going to be called, and then later they found out, the developers found out, the Science Fiction X, of course, is a magazine that's had a subscription for years, and they ended up having to switch it, and they chose Mass Effect, and Mass Effect is a great name. Mass Effect is a very scientific term. It's an effect that's within the game, and I think, let's be honest, this would be a completely different feel if it was called Science Fiction X versus what they chose, which of course is Mass Effect. Now for a second, I want to listen to this title music just so you guys can hear it. I find it interesting, I've reset the starting here so we can just watch that for one more moment. I find it interesting that they chose that as the original starting song. There is an exploratory feel with those horns, the longing sound, and they did a really good job. If you listen to that closely, there's a very longing sound to that, a mournful almost sound to it. But what's even cooler, to me at least, is in many ways, it reminds me of Whale Song, which I thought was really unique. You know, this is a time frame where every single main title theme had to be bombastic, right? It had to be that marching order type of music, which also works with exploratory gameplay and that feeling of moving forward. And as I've stated before, that imperialistic feel, which is very cool as well. But to go this route and to really show right away what the music was going to encompass, and it all tied together. We've also seen games where the theme music doesn't actually fit within the title itself, but this does. You could hear this music at any place within Mass Effect the game, and it wouldn't feel out of order. And you already get an idea of what they're going for with that analog synth, that slow wail. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't have more upbeat tracks, but it really does give you a theme right from the start. And I think it's very cool, really fits. Of course, here we have one of the things that I've talked about in the past on podcasts, one of the entries to a game throughout the character creator that doesn't just feel like a normal character creator. Hey, let's pick a guy. In this game, they did this corrupted memory where you actually get to see the memory become corrupted and you have to make this new character. Now, it's a very small aspect to a larger theme, which is that everything, including the character creation area, is not going to be a separate module. It's going to be well within the game world and make you feel like you're there. So here, of course, we're choosing these different classes. Now, one thing that's really important to remember is that what you choose does matter here. Both you get side quests, but also obviously in your skills and equipment, and then that intro that starts out where they talk about Shepard. And the idea of having different little tiny quest bits for these different characters is not incredibly unique, but once again, everything from that starting theme, right, that starting musical theme, to now, there is something very you are in our world feeling to this. And as somebody who plays multiple RPGs, many times it just doesn't feel as connected. Even a game like Skyrim, for some reason, doesn't feel as connected. Here, they give you a reason to be remaking your character, right? And in Skyrim, of course, you know, they're just like, hey, make a dude, here's your character. It sounds like such a small change. It sounds like such a small add, but it does so much for the overall theme that everything within this is an alternate world, an alternate universe. And it's important to remember that as we move forward, because you're going to see that repeated in places that some other games may not do. So I'm just going to make a dude here, scar him up a little bit. As we know, BioWare chose the Unreal 3 engine, and the Unreal 3 engine did have some difficulties with this title. We'll discuss the texture streaming issue that still occurs to this day, even though I've got this on an SSD. But it also has some issues with how it handles textures within the game world that are already streamed in, especially with Mass Effect. They just ran into a lot of little issues. They ran into some sound issues and some audio issues, sound being separate from audio because they had some issues with music dynamically mixing and stuff like that. It's really sort of sad because you have this game that has such high quality value, but when you go and look online for people who had sound issues on the PC version, it's absolutely astronomical, the amount of people who had an issue, especially if you chose to use hardware sound. As a whole, I would say that the graphics engine held up quite well. When it comes to the character creator, I was a little bit... the ability to make some really effed up looking characters is there. And anybody who wants to do that, that's there. But I was sort of surprised that by making a somewhat normal character, I happened to make a character that usually looks a little cynical, a little squinty, a little bit with the hooded eyes. And unfortunately, when you make that type of character, it just happens to be the one Mass Effect character, the facial trait. When you get that hooded eyes and those deep set eyes, you end up getting a large number of graphical errors on the character's face during cutscenes. Everything from the character looking like his eyes are completely closed to double lidding, where it looks like the character's got two eyelids. So when they blink, you see almost like two eyes, or that the eyelids are within the eyes. It's really sad because it's available. It's there. You should be able to do that. And I was really surprised that somebody didn't notice that in testing. But it's a little quibble. It's just something I notice the moment I make a character. You know, if a character I normally make, and it's not an effed up one, if that character doesn't work, it's just something I have to mention. So I'm going to make Biker McBikeman, and then we'll jump forward. Now, I'll talk about composition later, but I do have to mention that the composition right here, briefly, looks amazing. It's also connected to that main screen that we were just in, and it constantly gives you that feeling that you were not only going to the world, you were already within it, and you were just looking through that window. Let's listen.
He's the only reason Elysium is still standing.
We can't question his courage.
Humanity needs a hero. And Shepard's the best we've got.
I'll make the call.
There are so many world builders that just happened right there. It's funny because it's easy to miss. For example, right now we're seeing the Normandy, which is a main character in the game. Let's not ignore that. But when you go back and look at what just happened, one of the greatest things about that is that they went and they made sure that the average reading time of a person meant that they would get right to the end when that music reached that synth was just beating and it was climbing, and then boom, it hits Mass Effect as the title. Just really, really good sound design right there, and hits you right in the feels if, you know, you're into this type of title. A lot of people assume that this moment here where you see Shepard walking through the Normandy is all about Shepard, but really the Normandy, unfortunately, is a tiny bit cumbersome, especially when you first start. It's made really on a concentric, a different set of half circles if you really look at the way it's built. And it can be a little confusing when you first get into the Normandy. You're like, which room was where? And there's double rooms over the top of one another, especially in 2 and 3. It can even get a little bit different. So I like the fact that you're introduced to the Normandy in that way. You're introduced as he's walking through, or she, and you can feel like, oh, this is really just watching Shepard move around, but it's not. It's an introduction to the Normandy, which turns out to be one of the larger characters within the title. Now here, right at the starting, we're introduced a little bit to some BioWare history and ancestry. Their use of that same voiceover character that they've got for Caden. They also have Darth Nihilus, or Nihilus, who comes in. There's some connections to Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, and I like that. And they sort of fade out, and they start cribbing from their own games in 2 and 3, which makes sense. That's basically the way to do it. And one of the reasons I think we do see that here is not only because a lot of times if you've got a really good voice actor, you want to use them continually. They're somebody that you could really tried and true and you can trust, and sometimes names really have a feel to them, so sometimes names are reused. But when they created this game, there's really a duality of concern during the development of Mass Effect, and that's to one-up and improve on their prior titles. And they were considered a boutique kind of game developer, a game developer that put out a very specific type of title and did a really good job. But they also wanted to make that game genre-defining, and in the end, sell enough to get sequels done. Now that's much more easily said than done. When you're trying to make a game that's genre-defining, many times you're going to put systems within that don't have the iterations where there's some polish put on things. For example, the inventory in Mass Effect 1 that so many people find complex. So what did they do? Well, they tried to do that genre-defining aspect. They tried to add in some stuff, and I think that they did a really good job with that, but they also understood that graphics sell. And so they ended up making a game that graphically was impressive enough to pull people in to understand the science and the complexity of the title. And it worked. I think that they did a really good job. I think that you can do games in a different style. You can do, when you have this same kind of issue, you can of course take different tacks, but that's the tack they chose. And even on the Xbox 360, this game, when it first came out, was a looker, even if it was just because of the scientific aspect and the overall art design itself. So I think that they hit it. Here, of course, we have that first walk through the Normandy. I'm not a big fan of this area. I found, and of course, this kind of area is pretty much removed in the later Mass Effects. It's not because it looks bad. It's not even because it looks out of place. It's because there's rarely anything done there. It is one of those sections, a little bit like maybe there's a monologue in a movie with a character that really doesn't, there's really no reason for it. Well, that's sort of that area, that nothing happens there, nothing of substance other than to extend your time frame between leaving or talking to Joker. Here we're introduced to the typical BioWare issues. BioWare likes to incorporate real social issues into the games as quickly as they possibly can, and of course, we're almost instantly met with two things, which is racism, which we're getting now, and slavery. I was really actually quite pleased in the handling of these and the writing within it, especially in Mass Effect 1, even more so than 2 and 3, where I felt that the writing was much more subtle. Even if it was an in-your-face character, there was a subtleness to that writing that made you at least understand some of these characters, even their age. You know, they're an older character, so this is a world changing around them, and they're brought into this world. That character, Presley, on purpose is brought into this world due to their knowledge, but many times, institutional knowledge comes with institutional risk. It comes with institutional hatreds. It comes with institutional bias. And that is something that I think you always need to remember. Let's go ahead and listen to this conversation, because I want to show you some stuff concerning the narrative system.
We won't be staying on Eden Prime too long, will we? I'm itching for some real action.
I sincerely hope you're kidding, Corporal. Your real action usually ends with me patching up crew members in the infirmary.
Marines are meant to fight. You just fix us up when we're done.
I know how things work, Commander. I've seen my share of combat, but it's foolish to go looking for trouble. You could both take a lesson from the captain. He's not afraid of combat, but he knows the value of restraint, too.
Sorry, Doc, but this waiting's killing me. I've never been on a mission like this before, not one with a Spectre on board.
Just treat this like every other assignment you've had and everything will work out.
Easy for you to say. You proved yourself in the Blitz. Everybody knows what you can do. This is my big chance. I need to show the brass what I can do.
You're young, Corporal. You have a long career ahead of you. Don't do something stupid to mess it up.
Don't worry, sir. I'm not going to screw this up.
The captain's waiting for me.
Goodbye.
Of all of the moments of Mass Effect, that discussion is actually one of the more interesting ones to me from a game design element, because you actually see that adjustment of the model. You notice when you enter there that the model is leaning, that character, that soldier is leaning against the wall, something we see within Mass Effect 1 that wasn't being done in many other games, which is interaction of the environment during hiatus moments, during moments where a character is not actually doing anything, pauses within their animations, pauses within their gameplay. And you see them leaning, even later games many times, a character is either sitting or a character is talking and moving, but they're not interacting with the environment, leaning against things and having that interactivity, and then also moving away from them, which he does. So he's not in a static position. He's in a position, and then you get up to him and you start talking, and of course, he pops out. Additionally, that discussion is really, really cool because if you read it and you listen to it, there's not a single wasted word in that discussion. It is there to align you right away with what's going on and also start building the concentric circles of moral choices that you're going to have as you move forward. And one of the greatest things about Mass Effect, I felt, is that your time on the Normandy is a lot about talking. It's a lot about saying and not doing. And then later, I'll explain to you a moment where that sort of switches. And I think that the Normandy starts out as this safe place where, are you, as we say, walking the walk or talking the talk? Well, within the Normandy, there's a certain amount of, just talking through your ass if you want, because you aren't really engaged in anything and you're in a place of utter safety. Of course, that changes. So something many people may not know about Mass Effect is it actually allows for you to interrupt conversations and have a much more natural flow to the conversations than you see if you normally play it. If you're skipping a narrative, this is not the same thing. Basically, what happens is if you look at the way the structure is in all of the sentences, usually the first and or second is where most of the information is contained, and they don't have a lot of joiner, basically sentences at the very end that sort of make a good bump to the next bit. And that can be a little disjointed at times, where one character says one thing, the other character says another. It's almost like dueling speeches or dueling discussions at some kind of presidential debate, where they're not really feeding into each other. The very cool thing about Mass Effect is by hitting the space bar, you can instantly stop one character from talking and the next character in line will say something. Obviously, they thought of this because they fade out that initial character speaking. So for example, here, it's like two leaders talking to a subordinate. What's great is I can listen to that first sentence, hit the space bar, the next character will talk, the first character will fade out like they're interrupting one another, like they're talking over the top of one another. Additionally, there were plans in place to allow this, obviously, because if you do it and it's Shepard's choice to discuss next something or make a choice about something to say, they continue talking, but your radius, your dialogue dial comes up, and you can choose something and then hit space and interrupt. So you can have this very realistic, very organic discussion where people are talking over the top of each other and arguing, and you can interrupt them. And if you're somebody who plays a Shepard like I do, where I play a Shepard that's very to the point and action-oriented, it fits. From a design standpoint, very, very interesting and works really well throughout the entire title. Works in Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3 as well. Here, of course, we start hearing about Eden Prime, and Eden Prime is a great story block, an absolutely excellent cornerstone for this story. Eden, of course, reminding you of the Garden of Eden, this lush place, but with the Tree of Life, knowledge, both good and evil, and that's what's going to happen here. Additionally, it's fitting because Prime means first or of first importance, and so many firsts happen here. It's the first Reaper. It's the first meeting with Ashley. It's the first notice of Saren. It's the first combat. It's the first time where you are faced with a civilian populace and you have to decide how to treat it. Again, this is that moment where you start realizing that all of this was talking and you're getting ready to go and have to take what you have sort of thought and listened to, and it's not much. Here's Shepard. Now he has to make decisions when he gets on the ground about what he's going to do.
It proved we were ready to face the challenges of settling new worlds, to forge a place for humanity beyond Earth. It symbolizes humanity's growth and evolution as a spacefaring species. And after this, it will be known as the world where humans made a discovery of galactic importance.
Just give the word, Captain.
We should be getting close to Eden.
Captain, we got a problem.
What's wrong, Joker?
Transmission from Eden Prime, sir. You better see this.
Bring it up on screen.
Get down!
We are under attack, taking heavy casualties. I repeat, heavy casualties. We can't. Need evac. They came out of nowhere. We need.
cuts out after that. No comm traffic at all. Just goes dead. There's nothing.
Reverse and hold at 38.5.
This is ultimately where we start to realize that the Reapers are a lot like H.P. Lovecraft and the Elder Gods when you think about it, but also we're talking about Eden Prime, Garden of Eden, and this hand. It looks more like a hand here, and it's purposely obfuscated. You can't see it, but it looks a little bit like a hand, like the hand of God, the hand of creation and destruction coming down with this God lightning bolt. There's so many connections there with mythology and stuff like that. You can see them when, originally you might think, oh, it's just the electricity, the static electricity of a giant ship made of metal going through the atmosphere. It all makes sense, but there was a very real theme going on here, and that is to make you think that these were bigger than life. And that's that connection to Lovecraft. Lovecraft has always spouted out those ideals that we can't understand these things, these large entities that are out in space. And that connection to H.P. Lovecraft is hinted, including in recordings that you can hear in journals on some characters where they speak of dead gods dreaming, which is right out of, H.P. Lovecraft literature. It also speaks a lot towards cosmicism, which is the belief, and pretty much created by H.P. Lovecraft, that the universe and things within it are so vast and old that humans couldn't possibly understand them, which is sort of interesting because even Neil deGrasse Tyson has hinted at his own beliefs that maybe mankind isn't made up of the stuff to know the universe as much as we thought, or at the very least to a good depth. And he discusses many times the difference of intelligence between an ape and a human and that next level to understand the deeper mysteries of the universe itself. And it's a very unique mix-up of science and, Elder Gods, H.P. Lovecraft. We see that a lot of times in science fiction. We have seen this done in other games in the past, very older games, but we also see it a lot of times in other kinds of fiction. We've seen it in TV shows like Babylon 5 with the Shadow Wars, these elder races coming and sort of showing humans that, you don't really know what's going on. And I'll cover energy and races at a later time in this show, or maybe in Mass Effect 2 or 3's video, where we discuss in literature how different races have technically different amounts of energy or chaos within them that allows them to enact change. I think Mass Effect continued that trope a little bit, but tried to throw it somewhat on its head. Now we are introduced to the Geth and to Ashley Williams at first, and it's unique. It's such a waste, these dragon teeth, which are the items that they shove humans on and then transform them into husks so quickly. It's just crazy. What an odd way to do things. This is such a scientific race, right? A race of constructed AIs, a race of no wasted space and no wasted logic. And the way they transform people is by jamming them onto a fucking stick and thrusting them into the air. Even if they were helping the Reapers, you'd think they would have figured out another way to do that that was a little bit more technologically advanced. It's such an odd thing. Of course, now we're seeing combat as it is handled in Mass Effect 1. I enjoyed the combat in Mass Effect 1. I had no issues with it. We're going to jump here to Ashley Williams. I'll discuss combat here a little bit later. We discuss racism in these titles. BioWare likes to interject that speciesism. Ashley always interested me due to the overlapping racism that she had towards the other races, and of course other races have it towards humans, so it's basically an area where no one really likes anybody. But her racism is also tied in with her belief of she's religious. She has a belief of an end world and gods and dying and heaven and hell, and there's a cool threat there. If you really think about it, there's a threat there. This is a spacefaring character who's now seeing aliens, and who's to say that her belief is going to be right? And you almost feel that threat from her, where it's not just from a position. Many people's racism is from a position of just absolute ignorance, right? I mean, we know that. Hers is that as well, but there's this odd feeling of threat that's coming from the idea that your religious views are in question, not because people are questioning them or there's a little bit of science proving it may not be true. It's the fact that you are flying around with aliens, and they may have other beliefs that are different, and they may have existed for 10 million years prior to you. It's a very subtle wave of thought pattern that's going on through Ashley that I really liked, and I feel that the characters within Mass Effect tie into Shepard far, far better. They really make an impact on Shepard more so than Knights of the Old Republic or Jade Empire, which, as you guys know, are some of my favorite games of all time. But I feel that the game design elicited a far deeper connection between these characters and Shepard than any others, and I think that that's sort of known because when you look back at other titles from BioWare and you talk about characters that you really liked, many times it's because they were overdone, right? You have HK-47 in Knights of the Republic. He was out of his mind and a crazy robot, right? A crazy robot. You have Minsk in Baldur's Gate, who was sort of crazy. But that's the characters that most people remember. Not everybody, of course. I'm not speaking like this is just something that you have to believe. But in the case of Mass Effect, it's my belief that one of the reasons why we remember a lot of these characters and why it seems to be there's this large amount of people who like every type of character and they're talked about so much is the fact that they're all nuanced, far deeper, and even the crazy characters have a nuance to them. And that really, I would say, other than Zed in the later titles, there isn't really that typical homicidal character as much, because certainly, you guys, I mean, if you really look at the Krogan and you look at Rex, which we'll discuss later, he appears to be homicidal, but there is something far deeper going on in that character than any kind of just typical homicidal maniac would ever have. There is something far deeper in that, and that's the desire to push forward his race and to get them somewhere without the help, number one, of others ever again, because they feel that they, were ultimately betrayed. So here we got a little bit of the combat. I can see where the HUD sort of bothers people. This stop and start kind of gameplay, it exists in all of them, but the HUD sort of changed each version at least a little bit. I was not too bothered by the HUD or how it worked. I felt it worked pretty well. I don't really have much to say about the combat. I feel that what they wanted to do, of course, was to make your skills have an impact on your weapons. Many people don't like that. They want it so that, if you can shoot, if you can aim correctly, that's where the bullets fly. I sort of like the idea that it has to do with recoil and your ability and your familiarization with the gun as a character and not necessarily as a player. Okay, jumping forward. So I've played for a while. Here we're looking at the galaxy map, which the actions changed each damn time a new game came out. Personally, I actually really did like these side planets. I'm going to go to one. I'm going to find one here to go to. I do get the idea that, and I understand the reasoning why so many people disliked this, but I felt that in Mass Effect 1 they had a really good idea, and it felt like this galaxy-spanning adventure, and that what they should have done in Mass Effect 2 and 3 is corrected issues and not removed them. For some reason, and it could have been because they felt that they were under a time limit, that instead of trying to repair things and test things and do that slower iteration route, they just cored the fucking thing out. They just took an ice cream scoop to that entire design and removed it. I'll go on the record, I was a fan. I felt that it was done really well. I really enjoyed that exploratory gameplay. I felt that it tied the character into a deeper connection to the game and understanding the exploratory aspects of the game, because you're not only landing on planets that are just there to explore, you're also surveying, plus you have the major galaxy map. Then you can zoom out and you can exist within the Normandy. Then you can go to a place within your map, land, get out of the Normandy, and walk out into the place you landed on, which strangely enough they removed later, where sometimes you're not even using that exit chamber of the Normandy very often. So I don't know, it was just I was a fan of it. Here, of course, we have Joker flying sideways. Let's pick Ashley and Garrus. I like them. I'm such a fan of this landing drop. It's forward thinking, because we're just now doing that with rockets where we're landing them again vertically, and I love the fact that Mako comes down and they're all slow it down, compress your spines, and stop. Considering that this was originally on the 360, really looks good. There's everything from that pollen in the air to levels or planets where they have like meteorites striking. There was a good difference. Each planet felt a little bit unique. Not fully unique, because there were a couple planets that were sort of copies of one another, but I guess overall I'm just a really big fan. I'm also a fan of the Mako. I know a lot of people didn't like it. One of the things I'll show you when we get to any aspect, but I love how many different designs there were for the Mako, and whatever designs didn't make it as the original Mako, those designs are actually models within the game world in different places, destroyed or ruined or blown up. And so you can see almost all of the other ideas for the Mako just by keeping an open eye and looking around. And you can see those blown up, on fire, destroyed. I like the idea. I think it was intelligent. It's a good way to connect things, make things feel like they exist elsewhere, like you're not the only one. We see that in real life. We see the military be mirrored quite often by the civilian, right? I mean, that's something completely normal. The Hummer, you see those kind of things happen. And so the idea that this Mako might be used by another group as a science vessel, might be used by another group as a troop carrier, might be used as by another group for some damn tour on a planet, that all ties it in subconsciously, and it makes everything feel just a little bit more holistic as an experience. All right, so we've jumped back on the Normandy. I was discussing the Normandy originally and saying that there were some interesting aspects to it. I think many of the characters there are, but the Normandy is really interesting. Built by Turian, as we know in Humans, it's sort of a bid to like heal wounds that started that contact war. But the name also intrigues me because Normandy, as in the invasion of Normandy, the beaches of Normandy were only available for invasion 10 days out of each monthly cycle. There was a very specific cycle for invasion. Of those 10 days, that was when there was bright enough light due to the moon that people could land. And that was a very odd connection to the Reapers, and I'm not quite sure it was on purpose, but it does seem like a really odd connection. Additionally, and this is really just one more of those connections that may just be subconscious, all of the military operations involved in Normandy were under the code name Overlord, which happens to be the expansion for ME2, which actually involves, people going in and invading a Geth base. Again, those might just be very subtle connections that have nothing to do with anything, but it does seem really odd that you have this cyclic rate that you can go and you can land on the beaches of Normandy. The ship is named Normandy, which also has to do with the Reapers that can return every so many thousand years. And then you also have Project Overlord. So you have 4 or 5 sort of connections there. And again, those could be subconscious by the developer, where they just put something and they didn't really think things through, or maybe they read about Normandy long ago and sort of came up with some ideas there. Garrus is cool because he's one of the characters a lot like Ashley, where you see some growth between the different levels. But with Ashley, I never felt, even though she's one of my favorite characters, I never felt like you really saw it physically within the world except for what she says, right? Garrus turns words to actions. Everything he says here, the way he is talking, what he believes and how to do things, basically gets broken down in the later Mass Effects as actions he takes and what he turns into. That's really cool. They took this character and they really fleshed him out so that what he's saying right now isn't just a bunch of poppycock, right? It's not just a bunch of shit where it's basically to make you feel like, okay, he's gung-ho, he's with me. Instead, in the later titles, he actually takes it and turns it into action. Though, I have to admit, I've always had difficulty seeing the Turians as bird creatures. And later we'll discuss a little bit about their history, but that's always struck me as odd. Of course, now we have the Krogan, or bat people. Their facial structure, of course, as we know, was designed to sort of mimic a very particular bat that the developers had seen. Also, rhinoceros hide was something that they had talked about, that thick hide of their skin. The Krogan are really interesting to me because in and out of their suits, they don't necessarily look exactly like what I expected. In fact, his suit reminds me just really forcibly of the characters that come to get the Fifth Element at the very starting of the movie Fifth Element, the large blue armored creatures that are sort of a very slow moving space marine, but also with the big hulks in their backs. That armor that the Krogan wear really made me think they looked a particular way, and then seeing some of the designs and seeing much more of a gorilla-like aspect really surprised me. A gorilla lizard, a gizzard. Interesting, but not what I expected. I think it's also interesting that Rex continually, discusses things. His entire world is basically from a position of power. And I don't mean he is in a position of power, but I mean he sort of barters from a position of power. He has no problem, mouthing off to anybody. That's typical Krogan. But what he wants to do, there's a higher meaning to this character than there is other Krogan. And you get that not only from what he says in the stories he tells you, and that's a very good differentiator from the Krogan you meet. It does a really good job. We see that in some games where you meet a race, you have that race on your team, but there isn't much of a difference between that character and others unless it's like, oh, I'm following the good guy because I've chosen to be good. With Rex, there is a far larger goal for that character, and that goal puts him in this position almost of moral superiority to others. He is beyond certain things. Like, he's beyond being bothered by Shepard's ignorance, and that puts him, I think, on a higher pedestal to some gamers. Now, we'll talk to these characters a little bit before we go, but one thing you notice right away is you have this situation here where Shepard makes or assumes something that isn't true, and again, you have the characters interact through the filter of their lives to explain to Shepard. Shepard's talking to this guy. This guy's like, man, this alien's here all the time. Of course, what is Shepard thinking? He's thinking that this guy's a problem with the alien. So your choices all exist around that central theme where you can say stuff like, hey, I'll talk to this person to stop them from bothering you, and so on. No matter what you choose, this character, he turns around and says, well, no, actually, you're completely wrong. I didn't mean it that way. I actually love having him here.
Eventually, the sinks have to be vented. More than a few hours silent running, and they overheat. Cook us inside our own hull.
There's no way for anyone to detect us?
A visual scan can still pick us up. Anyone looking out a window can see us plain as day. But you have to be pretty close to get an actual visual out in space. Most vessels rely on scanners. As long as the stealth systems are engaged, they can't see us. Not unless we accelerate to FTL speeds.
Why doesn't it work with faster-than-light travel?
Cranking up to FTL blue shifts our emissions, pushes them into frequencies too high to capture in the sinks.
I just got to admit, I think that is really, really excellent scientific storytelling. It's not exactly the way things work, but the way he describes the blue shift of that energy basically no longer being able to be trapped by the heat sinks, it sort of makes sense and it doesn't, but it has enough science within it that it is, as we know with many science fiction books, it is plausible to the player. And additionally, there's actually more science here that's pretty much right or theoretically right than we see in even some TV shows. I dig the fact that the scientific explanation for some of this stuff is you're basically in a ship that's like a kid scuffing their feet on a linoleum floor and building up static electricity and touching people to stop it. I think that's really awesome. In fact, that'd be awesome if one of the characters was like, well, like a kid who just scuffs their feet. Occasionally you gotta touch shit, gotta discharge. Now we're going to move on to Tally, and a lot of people, you need to sit through this to make sure that you don't think that I'm just dissing on this race, but it is really a trash race when you look at the Quarians. And what do I mean by that? Well, a trash race in role-playing games or in books, in any kind of fiction, many times are where ideas that were possibly planned for other races are thrown in because people thought they were so cool. The Quarians at first seem like they make, that they're very complex, that they make some sense, but really when you start looking at them, there's a lot of trash that got thrown into this race. Let's talk about some good stuff first, and it's all actually good stuff. Let's just talk about some really interesting stuff. First, like the Turians, they're dextroprotein, which the idea that somebody thought of mixing that science in, this is science that right now scientists, astrophysicists, anybody discussing space travel are talking about right now. Basically, what that refers to is you have dextro and levo, and that refers to the way that amino acids are put together. Amino acids are the molecules of organic matter that's built up. But there are more than one way to build a molecule. So you can have molecules with the same elements and building blocks, but the structures are different. A molecule structure, though, is really important for how different other molecules interact with it, including, let's say, our stomach. So you know that the Quarians and the Turians both have issues with our food. For example, if they eat our food that is technically levo, they will end up not getting anything from it. And this is real science, guys. This is absolutely real science. It is what is used right now in the non-caloric sweeteners that we see in low-carb diets, that we see in their foods, where people will eat them and sometimes they'll have a little bit of gas or, well, just shitting yourself. That's basically caused by the fact that it is not digestible by humans. We do not have the receptors to attach to that dextro. And so we know for a fact that that's very real science, and many scientists have discussed, what happens if you go to a planet where everything's built, where it's actually dextro instead of levo, which is what we would need for food. You would basically go to a place and, hey, it'd be great for those of us who need to be on a diet, but that diet would end up in your death. Very cool science, very original idea to put within a game, and I really have to take my hat off to those guys to put that in there. Just one thing that really was being discussed scientifically by everybody involved in space travel. Now, with Tally and with the Quarians, there's a lot of talk about different things. For example, their one-child rule, which technically we know ZPG just doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. In fact, it would be more like a lottery, to be honest, with deaths being sort of tallied and then birth certificates given out to awaiting parents. But you have all kinds of offset problems if you're trying to do ZPG, because you have gestation periods, you have aging workforces, and then, of course, you have accidents that can pop up. It's best to assume that what they're really meaning with this one-child rule is actually a one-child for the most of the time rule, because if it was truly a one-child rule, there would be all kinds of actual real issues that would crop up. That's one of the problems I have with the race, is there's just a lot of weird little things that pop up that seem like they don't make sense, especially when you consider that this is a migrant fleet that really hasn't decided it wants to base itself anywhere. It continues to make enemies everywhere it goes because of how they handle resource gathering and so forth, but they don't actually try to stop that by landing anywhere. I mean, there's multiple planets just Shepard sees in the first 5 minutes of the damn game that they could live on. And it's just really odd that they do that. It's almost like a self-pariah race, a race that feels bad for what they did, so they decided to just constantly punish themselves. At the same time, they don't act like that. They feel set upon. So there's a couple issues there that I think feel like maybe those existed with other races, or maybe original ideas didn't get used, for the Quarians. Then you also have this, if you read about them, and you definitely listen to her, she talks about things like useful items, that items are really important to them, that their monetary system is built around items. They even have trade markets on all of the levels of their migrant fleet. But at the same time, they go on to talk about the fact that they just have places where they leave random items that aren't useful anymore. Well, guess what? Every item's useful, even if you're breaking it down to the requisite parts, which would be even more useful on a migrant fleet. So you have these tit-for-tats that go on when you really understand and read stuff, and it's so, for a lot of people, this is a very minor quibble, obviously, and I know that for a lot of people, this is one of their favorite races, but for me, there are a lot of weird oddities that occur with this race that don't occur with others, that really does distinctly feel like a world creator adding aspects from other races into this one because they liked those aspects. Even things like their weird naming conventions. The Admiralty Board, which is Royal Navy kind of stuff, it almost sounds like somebody thought that was a cool name, because the very next thing they talk about is the Conclave, which is, for the most part, has some religious connotations to it, many of them. And this is a scientific race, a race that uses ancestor worship, or it's not even really that, it's more ancestor high respectering. And when it comes down to it, it just feels like the Turians are a little bit patchwork. We're going to head into Pharos. I love that name. It does have that connotation of iron, that even though it's spelled different, ferrous, non-ferrous metals, and it's got a unique atmosphere to this world anyway, and it is a heavier atmosphere. If you look at everything from their architecture, their overall design of this place, it's all big steel, concrete, and pillars, much less spacefaring, much less slick, almost elven construction that we see in a lot of sci-fi in the future, even on the Citadel itself, which of course we know wasn't built by humans, but you see this different look, and it's even different from Noveria and Earth settlements that you see. Good mixture, good subtle connection between the naming convention and the design itself.
We saw your ship. Fidan wants to speak with you immediately.
Who's Fidan?
There's such an interesting underlying musical vibe to this area. Let's talk a little bit more about music. This location and that ambient throbbing soundtrack that's going on really fits. It just really fits with Pharos and the architecture and even the characters and the situation that's occurring here. There's a theme that you can really tie into. Jack Wall's made it clear that he likes to play a game to sort of get an idea of what's going on, and sometimes that wasn't exactly able to be done with Mass Effect, but I think they did a really good job. It's interesting to note that both Jack Wall and Sam Hulick turned in demos for Mass Effect, and Jack Wall won. Sam Hulick everybody liked his demo anyway, so they asked the two if they would work together, and you have what you have here. You have this big room composer in Jack Wall who likes physical instruments and has a bunch of, authentic instruments. And then you have Sam Hulick, who has stated very clearly that he likes his workstation to be portable. The dude wants to just get up and create content wherever he is. So you have these different artist styles coming together. I think they did a good job. Sam at times complained, said that Mass Effect 1 was a little bit difficult because of the disjointed way in which they created music, but I think really it's not necessarily any complaint about the music or anything. It's just sheerly a complaint about those work conditions being odd for him. He's probably not used to that. I still think they did a great job. I think that there's themes across multiple tracks within the game, and you don't always want the exact same musical score styling in every single track. That would be quite boring, actually, for the ear. And so in some ways, I think that little bit of discordance that you have between tracks here, because one may be written by one person, one may be written completely by another, I actually think it fits Mass Effect. There's a chaos in Mass Effect. When you look at the musical underscoring that occurs within the story of Mass Effect itself, you have this Mass Effect, you have this story of a character who's discovering new things left and right, new races, new creatures, new universal threat. When it comes down to it, I think the chaotic and a little bit discordant disconnect between different themes fits perfectly here. The Geth. As I stated before, they're an odd race. It's funny because everybody considers them the most difficult of all of the race to design. Originally, the Geth were not a machine race. They were sort of monkey looking. It's strange when you think about it that it took them finalizing the Geth race to really come up with a lot of the story that occurs within Mass Effect and identifying that, hey, you know what, let's go with this mechanical race. And then once they did that, they were able to tie it in, and they were sort of able to move from there. And it was sort of like the machine started once that real work began and somebody identified what the Geth would look like. But you hear everybody saying that once the Geth were finalized, no one ever wanted to see them again. You hear them say that multiple times in the Mass Effect making of video because they were so tired of that race, because there were so many difficulties in really identifying the overall structure, the theme, the identity of that race, and make it still unique like the others. Now, jump forward ahead. Here you have the much loved and also hated aspect of the Mako, which is where it's difficult to drive in some locations. I was a fan of the Xbox 360 version playing it. I didn't have an issue, but man, here we go. On the keyboard, I just cannot seem to get it right. I really like this aspect, this area itself, because this actually ends up showing you a couple wrecks of the Mako, as I discussed before, a couple of the designs of the Mako here, where they were, as I said, the original designs that didn't make it, and this ended up being the one. So it gives you that connection. This is a human colony, right? This is a place where humans have been, and so they are going to share a lot of that technology, and that's difficult to really always reflect. You want to make a level that looks different and unique from others, obviously, so that each is patterned in the memory of the game player. So what can you do? Well, one thing you can do is make that level that you want, make it as different as you want, but fill it or occasionally place within it items that solidify the fact that the overall race still built this. Of course, here and now, we're introduced to the Thorian, another one of, really, when you think about it, the pantheon of elder gods from H.P. Lovecraft that Mass Effect sort of entered into their game. You have the Rachni later, you have the Reapers, you have the Leviathans, and of course, you have the Thorian. And I like the fact that the Thorian is a little bit different than the others. It's a little bit more about using characters that it traps as tools. It doesn't unnecessarily go and have them killed. I think that's a very cool idea, even though, of course, we destroy it. But I like that idea of an elder race that is doing something that isn't necessarily 100% at the detriment of the other races. And this shot here, they do this multiple times in Mass Effect, this shot where you're looking at the character, but behind them is this alien race faceted as the background. From an artistic standpoint, that looming presence, that overall looming presence as the entire background, it's bigger than, right? It's greater than anything else. It is encompassing the vision, and the Asari, who are, millions of years older than the humans, are nothing compared to this elder creature. And it's really a good way of tying everything in together. In fact, you can sort of see the I guess you would say at the stair step of knowledge here. The human on the right talking to the Asari in the middle, and on the far left, this incredibly ancient beast that is so intelligent, so smart, and so beyond what we do that it thinks of us as nothing more than tools that sometimes blow out hot air that make squeak sounds for communication. And it really does put humanity in its place. It's also just a really good hard sci-fi aspect. Taking them down. Thorian. Pow, 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 pow. A lot of the feel of the flood there when they blow up. They blow up into tatters. It's like a bunch of mummies filled with gelatin. Poof! Bullet gelatin. Ballistics gel. All right. Gonna have to shoot his legs off. Sorry, brother. But you gotta go. You're like a bad bed bug. As I jump back on board the Normandy, we once again have this moment where everybody comes together in solidarity. This is something that was not done in Knights of the Old Republic 1 or 2 or Jade Empire or even by Baldur's Gate. You do have areas where you camp, Dragon's Age, stuff like that, but there's nothing like this. This constant, large, very large communal feel. And once again, even if Shepard disagrees, even if you as the character disagree with what everybody's saying, there's a very real connection to all of these other characters because they all say their little bits, and many times it doesn't make full sense, or many times it doesn't really feel like they're telling you the full truth, or many times it feels like they're afraid of something. It lodges them as a much more realistic character in my eyes than, say, if you were just going to go ahead and have them all agree with Shepard or not have these large meetings. And of course, going to Noveria. This is another place where a race is introduced, this time the Rachni, which are a very cool design decision. But Noveria itself is a place where I feel that the reflection of life in Mass Effect number 1 sort of falls apart. At times, it can feel incredibly, incredibly lonely. There's almost nobody there, even though all the characters discuss things as if there is a bunch of people there. And we get this in most fantasy games, where there's never enough of a population. Whiterun and Skyrim. There's never enough population to run the commerce, let alone, keep people in jobs and stuff like that. You have that kind of situation happen, but it's for some reason very, very prominently noticed on Noveria. Even here, it looks like construct a level. It looks like they asked somebody to just basically make a large room and put a single chair and table in the far right. And this has to be the absolute worst office in the universe. Strangely enough, that does and is mimicked at times in the Citadel, but overall, Noveria just really hits you right in the nose. You can tell right away that there just doesn't seem to be that reflection of life that you expect that exists in other games. It's almost like Noveria was last in the line of places created, and they didn't really spend a lot of times fleshing it out. Also, I would say Noveria is where I notice just a great deal of the problems we have and we know about in Mass Effect when it comes to the sound, the surround sound, the mixing. There's a lot good to be said about Mass Effect, about the sound effects and the sound sphere as a whole. However, there are also a lot of bugs and a lot of glitches. If you go online, especially for PC users, and you look at just how many problems and how many fixes, how many INI checks and changes that people need to do to get their software and hardware to work correctly and make the sound appear right in Mass Effect, it's ridiculous. Indeed, I've done all that, and I still notice on the Normandy, I'll be running and Shepard will stop making sound as he's running. It'll go like tick, 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 and then be completely done. Additionally, the sound effects for running and for movement in Mass Effect are disappointing. Completely disappointing. They are very low bit rate. They sound terrible. They sound truncated almost, like somebody has taken the top end and crushed it down a little bit. It just doesn't sound like a guy in armor running around or a guy in boots running around. And so those mixes, that mix of the sound errors themselves, as well as this, it can actually be quite bothersome to somebody who pays attention to the overall audio within a title. Now, all that being said, I think Noveria still has really good concentric circle questing that goes on, where you have a quest that can lead to one character doing something, a different character doing something else. You can turn the quest into one person or not. You can turn the quest into somebody else. You know, we noticed, and I've discussed already, that on the planets you have places that you can unlock where you need to get 2 or 3 places, and then you can do a quest. I think Depot Sigma 23 is one of those quests where you have to go a couple places and do something. So that's mimicked here, except it's at the very end. So you get the quest from one character, but at the end, you can unleash the ending part of the quest on multiple characters. You can go out and you can choose which of these characters. So you have this subtle concentric circle of choices that go on. Not only do you have the choice within the narrative that we're already well aware of, but you have the choice within the actual game itself who you're going to turn this quest into. We saw that repeated in Knights of the Old Republic. We certainly see it in Jade Empire. We saw it even in Baldur's Gate. But I think Noveria has one of the better ones. I think the Citadel also has a really good quest like that. So there's a couple places where I think that questing is done really, really well. I'll cover this more in Mass Effect 2 and 3, but I'm not 100% sure if anybody's aware, there is a meta rules system that you can use for any time you're role-playing a game, you want to play it again, where you can basically pick traits and different character attributes that you can play even if they're not within the game. For example, if I'm making the Shepherd and I've played the game a couple times and I want it to be a little bit fresh, you can pick these skills like or traits like, he's a technophobe. And so it sounds stupid because you're like, well, how's that fit within the game? You would be blown away. And I think it fits mostly within BioWare titles because they have a tendency, and Mass Effect for sure, they have a tendency to not tell you exactly what your character is going to say, but you can almost always find an answer that in some way fits these skills you choose. Now, why would you do that? Well, if you're like me and you want to play Mass Effect again and again, you really enjoy that game world, but you sort of want to break it up a little bit and the overall character creation doesn't allow you to do that, then you go to these meta rules sites that you can get, and there's tons of them. And you can choose a couple traits for the character that don't exist within the game itself, and then you play it as if they do exist within the game. You know, are you completely racist against the Turians, only the Turians, because of what they did to the humans? Well, if you are, then, you wouldn't have Garrus with you, or you would put him on the worst missions. It's very cool. You can do a lot of little differences and metagaming within the overall game, and when I found that, it really allowed me to enjoy Mass Effect even more than I originally did on multiple playthroughs. And I'll cover that a little bit more in depth in Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3, because they matter even more then.
You've never worked in the corporate world, have you, Commander? You can't bludgeon through bureaucracy.
You can't bludgeon through bureaucracy. Oh, yes, you can. He's the GOAT. He'll just headbutt his way through anything. And here we are with the Rachni. The Rachni were really interesting. They're one more connection to Starship Troopers, of which there are many in Mass Effect, by the way. There are a ton of connections to Starship Troopers and Mass Effect. One of the things I really thought was interesting is the fact that on the Rachni, those whip-like tails at the top were not supposed to be that originally. They were supposed to be spear pincers that you could basically, or that the creature could stab through people that it fought. And they had an issue with the modeling and the rigging. They basically weren't able to do it within the game, get the animation right, which is funny because if you listen to some of what they've said in interviews and so forth, and there's a couple people who don't work at BioWare anymore, don't work on Mass Effect, and they've done a couple interviews, you find out that a good deal of what they wanted to do and a good deal of the design decisions that they had were based on what they couldn't do, were based on what they wanted to do originally, couldn't do, and turned around and ended up doing to fulfill some gap. For example, the Rachni, if the Rachni had those pincers, then I think battle would have been different with them, maybe more interesting, but I also think that people would have seen that connection. Instead, you have this incredibly strange bug, those whips that look far more biological. The moment you start putting a carapace on everything, you have a problem. In fact, in the game, many races have some type of carapace, some type of thick, bony shell. This one does, but it's also got these whips, that adds a little bit more of an organic feel to it, and I like that. I think it was a great decision. I'm sort of glad it didn't work out, but it's interesting to know just how many problems they had with various character types. For example, when they were originally making the Krogan, they had them far more gorilla, even though they still have the gorilla heritage style in their look. They had far more of a gorilla movement pattern, and they couldn't do it with the animation, so they had to make them the way they are now. Once again, if you look at this composition of this scene, you see this evil Elder One, or as we term them, evil, but this Elder One behind, sort of watching everything in power. Still, even contained, it feels powerful. That's what's funny. Even contained, it's controlling this character right through the glass, right? And there's that cool feeling that's just like the Thorian and later the Reaper, where you have that step of knowledge. Human talking to a more advanced race, talking in front of an even more advanced race. Very cool layering and composition that goes on in these cutscenes to give you a feeling, even if it's subconsciously, that you are the lowest man on the totem pole, regardless of what you really do as Shepard, and in a way hints towards there being sequels and being a larger overall plot point. So I think I'm going to end this discussion a little bit on the overall theme of Mass Effect, especially number 1, and the idea, the theme that uplifting is a curse, that working for something is required, and if you don't do so, you usually always end up turning bad. And the reason why I'm bringing this up now, I love this location here because you land on this place and you know you're getting another character that you're going to be able to play, but it's this long, drawn-out battle to get to them, where you have to go through all these forces and go through this winding path. And by the time you do it, it really feels different than if you, let's say, had just landed and got the character without any real difficulty. There's I worked for it kind of mentality here. And that reminds me of something I wanted to speak about, which of course is uplifting being a curse within the game, and why they use that as the overall theme. So we know that they've used that. You have the humans who found the technology on Mars, and they're seen by many as a disease. They were uplifted, a lot of that stuff, though they did reverse engineer much of it. In the end, they didn't make a lot of those discoveries on their own, and so they end up opening the dormant gates, which everyone thought was dangerous, and the Turians end up attacking them. You have the Krogans, who were uplifted via the Solarians, and who were then turned into this awesome race, were given a bunch of technology and stuff that they didn't have. And at some point, they ended up not being able to understand how to use it. And what I mean by that is how to use it responsibly. And they ended up spreading around, and the genophage was created. Then you have the Quarians, who created the Geth. That AI got out of control. They not only lost their planet, they lost control of the AI, and they lost any chances, it looks like, of being a Citadel race for quite some time. Of course, we know that you have the Asari and that beacon that basically controlled their technology, and you find out later that was also controlled by an ancient race. But you also find out that technically the Reapers were created by the Leviathans, and you have in Mass Effect 1, you have the Leviathan of Dis, or Die, I think. So why am I mentioning this? Well, I think it's interesting. First, you see that kind of idea within most cultures, but you also see it definitely in science fiction, which is the belief that if you didn't create something, you won't have the institutional respect or knowledge towards it. And so misuse, it has a far higher chance of occurring. I think that is a fairly sound decision. What I like about Mass Effect is that they turn some things on their head. Now, originally, when I started this video, I said I'd talk a little about energy and races. One of the things you see, it's a typical trope in most fiction, science fiction, is that the elder races will usually have some kind of issue with energy. Now, what does energy mean? Well, for example, the elves don't breed as often in fantasy games. If you look at Babylon 5, the Shadows had a very particular way of doing war, which in many ways is a lot like the Reapers, but they didn't have the ability to really change their tactics, right? They didn't have that ability. What is strange to me, I personally feel, is that especially in the first title in the Mass Effect series, that the Reapers have a high amount of energy for an ancient race. What I mean by that is they still have a high amount of chaos to them. They still have a high amount of the ability to change tactics and do different things. You find out about indoctrination in Mass Effect 1, but in Mass Effect 2 and 3 it becomes massively used as an overall plot point, but you also still see them doing different things with different races, like the Collectors. Mass Effect 1 really sort of sets the standard, I think, for the fact that the Reapers may be like a lot of other creatures in fiction, but BioWare was smart enough to say, what do we do that differentiates them a little bit? And it seems like they came up with the idea to have them have a high amount of dynamics to them, to have that high energy, which is unlike, I'm telling you, if you look at any fiction, almost any fiction, you will see that for the most part, those ancient races, dwarves, elves, elder gods, there's something about them that usually indicates a rote set in your ways, kind of thought process without any real dynamic to it. And I like the fact that the Reapers aren't like that. The Reapers are like, screw you, if this isn't working, we'll try something else. They're very intelligent, and it's not always the try something else that you would expect in a game or in any kind of fiction. Some of the things they do, I think, are really useful to sort of spread and change that genre a little bit and make sure that other spacefaring games that come out after it may try to do unique things as well. So anyway, that's it for me. Just some cool thoughts about what goes on in the original Mass Effect. Again, I'm not going to show a ton in any of these videos because I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but I think I showed some of the cool bits, some of the new races that they introduce, and you know, it's a very, very exciting world, very interesting world, and a very cool video to do. So anyway, I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, hit thumbs up. If you didn't, hit thumbs down. Maybe share it, maybe spread it around on different forums, whatever. Peace out.
Targets down.
We're good, Commander.
Dare you to spin over the side.
Can you hear me out there? I'm trapped. I need help.
Are you real? Oh no, don't be stupid, Liara. Humans do not come here. You're hallucinating. And talking to yourself. Oh, goddess. I am going to die here.
We're here to save your sorry ass, so snap out of it.
You're rude for a hallucination. My subconscious must want to punish me for being this stupid.
Doesn't matter what you think. I'm getting you out of there.
You almost had me convinced there. I would not expect a hallucination to be defiant. Well, I'll play along. As you can see, I am trapped here. If you're as real as you claim, find a way to get me out.
How'd you end up in there?
Ah, yes, the figment of my imagination wants me to retrace my steps. See if I can figure out where... I was exploring the ruins. When the Geth showed up, when I turned it on, I must have hit something I wasn't supposed to. I was trapped in here. You must get me out, please.
You shouldn't have been messing with technology you don't understand.
I know how it works. Listen, if you're real, find some way past the barrier curtain. Then use the control panel to release me. If you're not real, leave me alone. I'm tired of talking to myself.
Negative contacts, Commander.
Now I am hallucinating that you are inside the tower. I must be getting worse. Earlier I even...